We meet at a dangerous moment for our 1 billion citizens. Russia's war against Ukraine rages on. An assertive grouping of adversaries seeks to divide and challenge us. There's war in the Middle East, terrorism poses a persistent threat, and new technologies bring opportunities but also many serious security challenges. In the face of this, we stand together, united in NATO, the most powerful defensive alliance in world history. History has shown that North America and Europe working together is a winning combination. Our adversaries know this. Our enduring commitment to Article 5, that an attack on one is an attack on all, sends a powerful message. In this meeting, we will take historic, transformational decisions to make our people safer through a stronger, fairer and more lethal NATO. To make NATO stronger, we have a concrete plan for all allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It will go towards core defense as well as defense and security-related investments. This decision is deeply rooted in our core mission and is required to resource our plans and readiness. This will also make NATO fairer, to ensure anyone and everyone contributes their fair share for our security. For too long, one ally, the United States, carried too much of the burden of that commitment, and that changes today. President Trump, dear Donald, you made this change possible. Your leadership on this has already produced $1 trillion in extra spending from European allies since 2016. And the decisions today will produce trillions more for our common defense to make us stronger and fairer by equalizing spending between America and America's allies. Allies will also agree to further increase defense production so that our armed forces have everything they need. That means a huge expansion of our defense industrial base on both sides of the Atlantic. That's good for our security, it's good for our economies and good for our jobs. Our decisions include continuing our support to Ukraine, while also pushing for a just and lasting peace. We all want the bloodshed to stop. We call on Russia to end its aggression against Ukraine. Let me now turn to Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Dick Schoof, whose government and people are graciously hosting us here. Thank you to the media for joining us. We will continue our discussions in just a moment, but first, and with the media here, please, Dick Schoof, your introductory remarks.
Thank you, Mark. Colleagues, friends, allies, on behalf of the Dutch government, welcome to The Hague. This is the NATO summit, the first NATO summit ever to be held in the Netherlands. And we are honored to have you here in this city that has been speaking in the language of peace and justice ever since the first Hague Peace Conference was held in 1899. I'm convinced that after today, The Hague will also be known as a city of collective purpose, unity and resolve. After all, we are about to write history. We are about to make decisions leading to an unprecedented increase in our collective defense spending and a new financial balance in our alliance. Both are urgent, both are necessary, and both will help make our transatlantic bond even stronger, so we can do justice to our founding principles of democracy, liberty and the rule of law, as laid down in the Washington Treaty. The last NATO event held in The Hague was a foreign minister meeting in 1989, just as the Iron Curtain was beginning to break apart on the eve of the Cold War's end. And for a period, we hoped and believed that relations with Russia would continue to thaw. But the end of history turned out to be an illusion. An illusion that was shattered for good when Russia brutally invaded Ukraine. So today, there is a renewed awareness in our ranks that peace cannot be taken for granted, that it must be protected constantly and with conviction. And yes, peace comes at a cost. We must act on this swiftly and decisively. So let's stand united and embrace the Hague Defence Investment Plan. Let's go to work and write that history today. Thank you.
So thank you for the media for joining us, but in the spirit of democracy, I have to ask you to leave the room now. Thank you.
We just heard Mark Rutte speaking at the NATO summit. Meanwhile, the NATO leaders are gathered in The Hague for a crucial summit dominated by defense spending and unity among allies. The summit began with a formal dinner hosted by the Dutch royal family, followed by a group photo ahead of the high-stakes talks. Mark Rutte has kept the summit focused on spending, even accepting a diplomatic compromise with Spain, which opposes the 5% defense target. Rutte also privately praised Trump for his decisive action in Iran, saying Europe would now pay big and Trump would claim the win. The two-day summit comes as NATO marks 75 years since its founding. The alliance now boasts 32 members, with Sweden joining most recently. Ukraine, still outside the bloc, continues to push for membership amid ongoing war. NATO leaders are expected to back a new defense spending goal of 5% of their GDP, a major shift from the current 2% target. In a joint meeting on the sidelines of the NATO summit, Alliance Chief Mark Rutte and US President Donald Trump declared a major breakthrough on defense spending. Rutte confirmed that all NATO members will unanimously back a new defense spending target of 5% of their GDP. He stressed this move is about European and Canadian allies shouldering more of the burden, not American taxpayers. Rutte also praised Trump for pushing NATO nations to boost their defense commitments. Trump called it a great victory for everybody, adding that spending will be equalized soon. Dutch Prime Minister Dick Schoof says the alliance remains united despite Spain's push to opt out of a new 5% defense spending target. NATO Chief Mark Rutte stressed that in the face of Russia's long-term threat and China, North Korea, and Iran's support for Moscow, higher defense spending is unavoidable. Meanwhile, Spain has formally opted out of NATO's new defense spending goal of 5% of GDP. Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez announced the move on national television, calling the target disproportionate and unnecessary. Sánchez said Madrid respects other countries' defense priorities but insists Spain can meet its NATO commitments with just 2.1%. The announcement followed a letter sent to NATO Chief Mark Rutte, where Sánchez said Spain would not adopt the new target. Meanwhile, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen says NATO's new 5% defense spending target is important and necessary. She warned that years of underspending have left the alliance really busy to catch up. Now we have guests joining us for this discussion. Ross Feingold, he's a political analyst joining us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for joining us today. Is the 5% defense spending target realistic according to you, or is it just a symbolic win for Donald Trump and NATO's leadership?
I think it's realistic. Some of the NATO members are going to reach this target. So even though some countries have already opted out, like Spain, and some countries might struggle to reach it in the near term, I think it's a realistic target. And we see that Rutte, the Secretary General, is all in on this. Trump is going to put pressure on NATO members as well. And given the risk that exists from Russia and possibly China, I think a lot of the NATO leaders actually know that it's the right thing to do.
And Ross, how significant is it that all NATO members except Spain are backing this new defense spending goal, and also the fact that the rest of the NATO leaders are not criticizing Spain openly about this?
A lot of work went into this by the Secretary General, Mark Rutte. Clearly, he's gotten the leadership of various countries, NATO members, on board with this 5% target. It's a little unclear, again, how quickly the NATO members will reach that target. And he also kept the criticism of the deal with Spain to a minimum. So some credit goes to Rutte for that as well, although, of course, President Trump is going to be very critical of Spain's opt-out.
And since you are in Taiwan, I would like to ask, how are media covering this over there, and are Asian countries interpreting NATO's shift to increase in a 5% defense spending target? Does it change the Indo-Pacific security equation in any way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, a lot of countries in this part of the world have very obvious security concerns. South Korea has to worry about North Korea, Japan and Taiwan have to worry about China. Other countries in Southeast Asia have sovereignty disputes with China in the South China Sea. So I think countries in this part of the world, they're prepared for pressure from the United States. There's no multilateral system in this part of the world like NATO in Europe, but most of the countries that are friendly to the United States, they have close military security cooperation with the U.S. Some of them are bilateral treaty allies, defense treaty allies with the United States. So I think leaders in this part of the world are already prepared for a lot of pressure from the Trump administration to significantly increase their defense spending.
And is there any concern in Taiwan about that NATO's increased commitments might further push or create distance between China and NATO?
I think Taiwan, and as well as Japan and South Korea, which the latter two, which have significantly increased their interactions with NATO in recent years. Japan now has an ambassador to NATO, for example. I think there's an appreciation that more defense spending among European countries will make them better prepared to deal with contingencies wherever they might occur, whether that's in Europe or whether that's even in the Indo-Pacific. Although I think realistically speaking, countries here know that it's unlikely that European countries would fight a war in Asia, maybe with the exception of the UK, which might come to the assistance of the United States if the United States gets involved, or if Australia gets involved in a war in this part of the world. But I think, generally speaking, countries in this part of the world look at the increased NATO member defense spending as a positive.
Thank you, Ross Feingold. You will stay with us. We have now another news. Article 5 is the cornerstone of the NATO alliance. It states that an attack against one member is considered an attack against all. It was established in 1949 under the North Atlantic Treaty to ensure collective defense. When invoked, NATO allies can respond individually or jointly with armed force to restore security. It has been used only once in history, after the 9/11 terror attacks in the United States in 2001. Article 5 is designed to deter aggression, especially from outside powers, by guaranteeing alliance-wide retaliation. It is a political commitment, not automatic, meaning members decide how to respond based on consultation. Now we are going back for this discussion with Ross Feingold. He's a political analyst. Thank you to Ross for staying with us for this. Do you think that Ukraine is trying to join NATO for now, and even though Ukraine is not in NATO, how do you interpret the support given by NATO nations to Ukraine as of now?
Some of the NATO members are extremely outspoken and remain unified in their commitment to assisting Ukraine, most notably the UK, France, Germany, Poland, and some of the smaller countries as well within NATO. So even though the Trump administration has taken a very skeptical view of military aid to Ukraine, and President Trump has tried to bring Ukraine and Russia into a ceasefire or peace talks, which has occurred in recent weeks for 2 rounds. I think Ukraine is generally appreciative of the assistance that comes from NATO members. Ukraine certainly likes to hear messages, verbal messaging that comes from some of these leaders about the importance of aiding Ukraine and continuing that. And for Ukraine, that kind of balances off the lack of commitment that comes from the Trump administration. So when it comes to the new defense spending target among NATO members, I think Ukraine would, of course, welcome that as well.
And staying on the same, how do rising tensions with Russia, now Ukraine being targeted more and more, and the civilian casualties increasing, and growing ties between Moscow and China justify NATO's drastic increase in defense commitments?
I think there are some NATO members who have legitimate concerns that they may be attacked by Russia. That's one factor in the new defense spending target of 5% of GDP. And again, from Ukraine's perspective, I think they look at this as an assurance that some of the European members of NATO are going to continue to provide military assistance to Ukraine, as they have done now for over 3 years. So for Ukraine, even though there is no chance that they're going to get into NATO in the near term. The United States under the Trump administration has basically vetoed that. But with the higher defense spending by NATO members, I think Ukraine could have some confidence that it will continue to receive military aid from certain NATO members.
Thank you very much, Ross Feingold, for joining us. You will stay with us. Now, meanwhile, Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking on the sidelines, warned that Putin only thinks about war and held bilateral talks with French President Emmanuel Macron to rally support. Zelensky attended a pre-summit dinner, and he's hoping to secure more weapons and tougher sanctions on Moscow. This comes as the Russian missile strike on the Ukrainian city of Dnipro killed 17 people and injuring over 200. Zelensky says Russia has flatly rejected any ceasefire talk, adding that global pressure on Moscow is still insufficient. Meanwhile, the White House confirms President Trump will meet Zelensky this week on the sidelines of the NATO summit in The Hague. Meanwhile, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says NATO allies are increasing defense spending to counter the threat from Russia, not to please anyone. Speaking ahead of the NATO summit, Merz warned that Moscow poses a threat to peace and order across Europe, not just Ukraine. He said the decision to ramp up military spending comes from conviction and that Europe must do more to defend itself. Listen in to what Merz has said.
Ich gehe davon aus, dass wir heute eine gemeinsame Entscheidung treffen, die NATO in Zukunft mit wesentlich besseren Mitteln auszustatten. Wir werden einen Beschluss fassen, dass die NATO in Zukunft 3,5% und 1,5% zusätzlich für die Infrastruktur zur Verfügung stellt, für unsere Streitkräfte. Dies alles wird in großer Übereinstimmung stattfinden, weil wir übereinstimmend feststellen, dass sich die Bedrohungslage geändert hat. Und die Bedrohung heißt insbesondere Russland. Russland bedroht nicht nur die Ukraine, Russland bedroht den gesamten Frieden, die gesamte politische Ordnung unseres Kontinents.
Meanwhile, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban says Russia doesn't pose a real threat to NATO, calling the alliance far stronger. He also warned that economic competitiveness, not security, is the bigger danger. Orban added NATO has no role in Ukraine and praised Trump as a man of common sense. Now we have guests joining us for this discussion. Ross Feingold is a political analyst joining us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. What do you think about the comments made by leaders in NATO that this alliance and this push towards increasing the defense spend to 5% is not because of the threat to a threat that Russia is the threat, and not because of U.S. or nobody said it, but hinting towards the fact that Trump is pushing them for this commitment?
They have to deal with the reality that the President of the United States at the moment is President Trump. President Trump has long had skeptical view towards NATO. He's had skeptical view towards the defense spending commitment of NATO members. And as the most powerful NATO member, when the President of the United States says, I would like you to do something, other countries, the NATO members, they really have to listen, and frankly, they have to comply. That's just the reality that the NATO members have to deal with. So when President Trump says 5% of GDP on defense spending, we see a number of NATO member countries that say yes, and they're aiming to actually comply with that goal.
And now looking at Zelensky, he apparently has talked with Macron already, and he has plans to talk alone with Trump soon. Why do you think Zelensky is now doubting down on calls for tougher sanctions, and have existing measures clearly failed to deter Moscow?
Most of what Zelensky does on the international stage, such as attending multilateral meetings like G7 or NATO, is he's positioning Ukraine for the best position it could be in dealing with Russia in ceasefire talks. He knows that the United States is going to put pressure on Ukraine. Zelensky knows that the United States is going to put pressure on him and Ukraine to accept the ceasefire terms with Russia, which might very well involve Russia continuing to occupy territory of Ukraine that Russia currently occupies. So whether it's ensuring that NATO members continue to provide military equipment to Ukraine, or getting commitments from the United States and other European countries to spend money on reconstruction in Ukraine. A lot of what Zelensky does and the meetings that he has and the messages that he brings to the other leaders is really about positioning himself and his country for the best possible outcome in ceasefire talks.
And now staying on this, how much do you think the Ukraine issue still unites NATO, or are we beginning to see fatigue set in among some members, according to you?
Well, certainly there's some fatigue, but other than the United States, the most important and the most military powerful members of NATO, like the UK, France, and Germany, as of now, they seem to be very united in support for Ukraine, including providing weapons to Ukraine. So even though there's been changes of government in the last year, whether in the UK or whether in Germany, the new leaders and the continued leadership of Macron in France, they've remained committed to Ukraine. And I think Ukraine is very, very fortunate in that, because of the skepticism from the Trump administration about military aid to Ukraine. But at least Ukraine for now can still rely on the UK, France, and Germany.
Thank you very much for sharing that insight. You will stay with us for our next story. A preliminary U.S. intelligence report says American airstrikes set back but did not destroy Iran's nuclear program, despite President Trump's claims of complete obliteration. The classified assessment says key underground sites remain intact, enriched uranium stocks are safe, and Iran's nuclear timeline is delayed by just months, not years. Trump dismissed the report as flat out wrong and praised U.S. pilots for what he called a perfectly executed mission. The White House accused leakers of trying to undermine the president and U.S. credibility. On the other hand, IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi warned inspections in Iran are disrupted and conditions are unsafe, with sites containing rubble and possibly unexploded ordnance. He says Iran has taken protective measures with enriched uranium, but inspection access remains limited, raising serious concerns over transparency and monitoring. He urges renewed dialogue with Tehran, possibly in Vienna, saying the knowledge and industrial capacity to build a bomb already exists and cannot be denied. All while Kremlin says UN nuclear watchdog's reputation has suffered seriously due to US and Israeli attacks on Iranian nuclear facilities. Meanwhile, the fragile ceasefire between Israel and Iran appears to be holding after nearly 2 weeks of escalating airstrikes. Israel says its campaign removed 2 existential threats: Iran's nuclear capabilities and its missile arsenal. Here's what Efi Defrin, Israeli army spokesman, had to say.
לומר ראשית שאנחנו עמדנו בכל יעדי המבצע כפי שהוגדרו לנו, ואפילו בצורה טובה יותר ממה שחשבנו, באופן מיטבי. אני אומר את זה בצניעות, כי עדיין מוקדם לקבוע את הדברים, אנחנו חוקרים ובודקים את התוצאות של הפגיעות שלנו בכל המערכת, הפאזל הזה כפי שקראתי לו בעבר, המרכיבים השונים של תוכנית הגרעין ועוד. שהערכה היא שפגענו משמעותית בתוכנית הגרעין, ואני יכול לומר גם שהשגנו אותה למשך שנים, אני חוזר, למשך שנים לאחור. כוחות הגדוד מבצעים התקפות על יעדי טרור, מאתרים ומשמידים פירים ומנהרות ומחסלים מחבלים. אתמול אחר הצהריים, במהלך פעילות מבצעית, הוצמד מטען על רכב משוריין מסוג פומה של כוחות החטיבה. כתוצאה מכך, הרכב המשוריין עלה באש. נשלחו כוחות חילוץ ומסוקים לנקודה, הם ביצעו ניסיונות לחלץ את הלוחמים, אך ללא הצלחה.
Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu declared a historic victory but added Israel's campaign is not over yet. Iranian President Pezeshkian called the ceasefire a great victory for his country and signaled readiness for renewed dialogue with the US and regional players. Trump's envoy confirmed promising indirect talks with Iran are underway, aimed at a long-term peace deal. At the UN, European nations urged Iran to return to nuclear talks or face renewed sanctions. Iran's airspace remains closed till Wednesday, but civilian restrictions have been lifted across Israel. Whether this truce leads to diplomacy or just a pause in conflict remains uncertain. Now we have guests joining us for this discussion. Ross Feingold, he's a political analyst joining us live from Taipei. Thank you, Ross, for staying with us. According to you, how damaging is the gap between President Trump's public claims of complete obliteration and then U.S. intelligence assessment showing only a limited delay? And what risk does the White House run by dismissing internal intelligence findings?
This is one early, very preliminary finding by one agency. We have to keep in mind that there's numerous intelligence agencies that have yet to release their own analysis and findings about the damage to Iran's nuclear weapons program. So it's still early days. It's not a surprise that President Trump was angry about this report being leaked and the doubt that it cast on the damage that was done by the U.S. bombing and earlier by the Israeli bombing. So I think the best we could do at the moment is just wait and see. But there's a very important thing to keep in mind. If subsequent analysis indicates that Iran still has the ability to research and develop nuclear weapons, that's going to be the end of the ceasefire, and we might see more military action from Israel and or the United States.
And last but not least, looking back at what has happened in the past 13 days, does this whole episode strengthen or weaken the U.S.'s power or U.S.'s dominance and effect towards maybe regions like Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, which had great relationship for a while with Trump?
Some of the Gulf countries were critical of Israel's attack on Iran's nuclear facilities. They publicly didn't praise the U.S. bombing of Iran's nuclear facilities. But the reality is the Gulf Cooperation Council countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, they appreciate the role that the United States plays in Middle East security. And even though those countries might maintain good relations with Russia and China, as of now, they still look to the United States to be the security guarantor in the region and their closest security partner. So the truth is those countries are probably very happy that the United States got involved, even if they might not say so publicly.
Thank you very much, Ross Feingold, for joining us today and sharing your insight on all the stories for today. Now we move on to our next story. China's foreign ministry has now responded to Trump's statement on China's import of Iranian oil and said that China will take reasonable steps for its national interest to ensure its energy security. This comes after U.S. President Donald Trump said that China can continue to purchase Iranian oil after Israel and Iran agreed to a ceasefire, a move that the White House clarified did not indicate a relaxation of U.S. sanctions. He also expressed hope that China would also purchase plenty of oil from the United States. According to reports, Trump was drawing attention to the fact that Iran had not yet attempted to close the Strait of Hormuz to oil tankers, a move that would have posed significant challenges for China and the world's largest importer of Iranian oil. Trump's statement came shortly after the ceasefire announcement and were viewed by markets as bearish signal, contributing to a nearly 6% drop in oil prices on Tuesday. Despite the remarks, oil traders and analysts in Asia reportedly do not expect immediate changes in China's buying patterns. Iranian oil makes up about 13.6% of China's oil imports so far this year. In contrast, U.S. oil comprises only 2% of China's imports, with Beijing's 10% tariffs continuing to dampen demand. Now we stay in Asia. Tensions are flaring once again between China and Taiwan, this time over the interpretation of history. China insists it cannot invade Taiwan because the island is already part of its territory, a claim Taiwan strongly rejects. Chinese officials point to post-World War II declarations as proof of that Taiwan was returned to China after Japanese occupation. But Taiwan's President Lai Ching-te calls that a distortion of history, asserting Taiwan is a sovereign country with a 113-year legacy as the Republic of China. Beijing continues military pressure near Taiwan, while Taipei warns against historical revisionism. With both sides digging in, the rhetoric is escalating at a time of growing regional tensions. Now we move on to Africa. Thousands of protesters took to the streets of Nairobi today, marking 1 year since the deadly storming of parliament during anti-government demonstrations. The protests last year left at least 60 dead amid clashes over economic hardships and tax hikes. This year, police blocked roads and secured government buildings ahead of planned rallies. Many young Kenyans called for President William Ruto's resignation, chanting, "Ruto must go." The government urges peaceful protests but warns against violence. Police chiefs have addressed the media to clarify protests rules and security measures. Here's what the Inspector General Douglas Kanja has said.
Any contrary conduct constitutes an unlawful and a riotous assembly. The National Police Service shall, at all times, lawfully and firmly prevent any breach of peace by any group of or groups of persons acting contrary to the provisions of the law.
An Australian woman is standing trial for allegedly serving a fatal meal made with poisonous mushrooms. Erin Patterson is accused of cooking a lunch that killed 3 family members in Victoria last year. Prosecutors say she used death cap mushrooms, one of the world's deadliest, and knowingly added them to individual portions. Patterson has pledged not guilty to multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. She insists the deaths were a terrible accident and that she never intended to harm anyone. The judge has begun a second day of instructions to the 14-member jury, which must reach a unanimous verdict. The case has gripped the nation, sparking debate over mushroom for aging laws and family feuds turned deadly. The trial continues this week in Melbourne. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring more news updates from around the world.